Listening is a tragically underestimated skill. Most people think it's a capability. It's not.
Let's talk about talking. I've assembled for your pleasure here 7 deadly sins of speaking.
Isn't it the number 6 TED Talk of all time now?
I was quite brave doing that. I mean, if you're going to stand on a TED stage and talk about talking, you better talk quite well.
Right.
You know, people often say, I can't get heard. You know, I feel frustrated. I can't make a difference I want to make in the world because people aren't listening to me. How do I get them to listen to me? And the answer is, you listen to them.
Welcome to another episode of Unlock Your Potential, where we get to have amazing conversations with amazing human beings. Today, we were joined by Julian Treasure, coming to us from Orkney Island off the coast of Scotland. Julian is a top-rated international speaker on sound and communication skills. You might have been exposed to him the same way that I was initially through one of his TED Talks. He's given 5 TED Talks. They've been viewed over 100 million times. In fact, just one of them, the one that I first saw, which was called How to Speak So That People Want to Listen, I think that one by itself has now been listened or viewed over 100 million times. But what I found from listening to him is that this is stuff that anybody can apply to deepen relationships. Through the way we talk, we can deepen the other person's experience of being heard, listened to, or even felt. That there's, talking and listening are 2 sides really of the same coin in the way that we present ourselves. And I've found that what he teaches is highly relevant for everyone. It's not just a business strategy. It's not just a corporate leadership strategy. So on that note, I invite you to listen to my conversation with Julian Treasure. I was reading on your biography. So it sounds like we both share a common origin in the music business. You were a musician at one point, and that's how you got into sound and I guess, what would you be called, a sonophile or an audiophile? What's the term for your proclivity?
Well, I think I'm a sound evangelist really now, because that's what I do a lot of the time is speak about the importance of sound and especially the importance of listening. But you're right. Yes, it started with music for me, performing. And, music's important. If you play in a band or in an orchestra, you have to develop a way of listening which is different from the kind of inattentive listening that most people go around in life with. You've got to listen to all the other instruments all the time. So it's a sort of multi-track, very attentive listening. Because if you're not doing that, you're not a very good player. You're not listening to the rest of the group. So, I developed that and I cared about music deeply from a very early age. I go back to the days of vinyl before the recent vinyl kind of renaissance. And, I used to sit in a darkened room with an album cover on my knees and a pair of headphones on, reading the back avidly and listening to everything. And so music's always been a huge, huge part of my life and my existence, my enjoyment of the world. And so listening developed from there. I started to play the drums. I played in bands. I was a professional musician for a while. I've played festivals and lots of gigs and so forth. And incidentally damaged my hearing in the process. I've got no hearing above about 12K, which is typical for a drummer because you're whacking cymbals quite close to your ears for years and years, and it doesn't do them any good. That was definitely the start of it. And then a long career in marketing where, I was doing that by day, doing brands, understanding brand communication and dealing with marketing directors and producing customer magazines, beautiful magazines for their brand. And then in the evenings, I was playing gigs and thinking, along the way, I was thinking, the world doesn't sound that great. There's a lot of bad stuff out there. And why is this? So when I sold the magazine business, it was time to bring the 2 halves of me together, really, the marketing bit and the listening and sensitive to sound bit. And so I formed a company called The Sound Agency, which was all about the question, how does your brand sound?
So can you double click on that for us? That's sort of one of those questions that takes people a second to process, right? How does your brand sound? I don't think that's what most people think of. People think of visual iconography and more things, that are more consistent with branding in people's minds. So can you, like I said, double click on that and talk a little more about what does that even mean, how a brand sounds?
Well, if you go and see a marketing director of a big brand, you say, do you have a brand book? And they say, yeah, of course we have a brand book. It's that thick. And so it's all about logos and colors and typefaces and how to use it and how not to use it and so forth. And so I would say, okay, how many pages are about sound? None. And you just think, well, wait a second. We experience the world in 5 senses, not one. We experience brands in 5 senses, not one. So then I would go on to explain the power of sound, which was my first TED talk, the way sound affects our bodies, heart rate, breathing, hormone secretions, brain waves, our emotions, our feelings. You only have to think of music to get that one. Our thinking, our cognition, how well we can process and how productive we are. Just think of trying to work in a noisy open plan office. And our behavior, what we buy, how much we what we do, how long we stay in certain places like shops or other places. There's a huge amount of power in the sound around us. So then the marketing director will go, that's interesting. Well, we've got nobody in charge of sound. We've never thought about it. Maybe we should do some sound next year. At which point I have to point out, unfortunately, you're already making a lot of sound. You have been for years and years. It's just not planned, not designed, not intentional in any way, and probably working in the opposite direction to all that money you're spending on visuals. So there we go. It's about designing for all of the 5 senses, really, but certainly for the eyes and the ears. I would say they're the 2 major ones. And making sure that what you do is congruent, is pointing in the same direction, saying the same thing in the same way. Then you get a thing which has been established by the research to be a multiplier effect. It's called super additivity. And it means that 1 + 1 is much more than 2 if you do it right.
So you're saying that when what somebody is perceiving through one sense is congruent or resonant, maybe is a word, with what they're perceiving from another sense, it's kind of like a geometric reinforcement effect, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a multiplier effect, definitely. And it works the other way, unfortunately, as well. So if you are a supermarket and you spend lots of money on, you understand customer flows and aisle, planning, and you're rotating stock, and you've got signage and you've got branding and so forth. And then you've got clashing, squeaking trolleys bumping into things. You've got air conditioning going zzz, zzz. You've got chiller cabinets making the same noise. It sounds a little bit like an industrial premises. People won't stay in there longer than they absolutely have to. I mean, do we love going to the supermarket? No. And that's mainly because of what's happening to our ears. Not so much the smell, not so much the sights that we see. It's the intense and very unpleasant sound that we have to survive. And of course, when you get to the tills, beep, 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 or up and down a row of 20 tills. And no wonder that staff turnover on those tills is absolutely astronomical, because that's a very punishing auditory environment to be in for 8 hours a day.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I think about the self-checkout machines, and I have a deep, really, really negative relationship with those self-checkout machines. I literally get enraged because they have that thing where you scan it and then there's a window of time for you to set the item down. But if you set it down too hard or you wait too long, then the scale doesn't perceive things. Or sometimes I actually like to take a bite out, I'll buy a bag of something, rice cakes, and I'll eat one while I'm going around the store. And then when I set it on the scale, it's the wrong weight.
Unexpected.
It thinks I'm trying to shoplift. Yeah. And it makes that noise. It goes, and I'm like, and that noise is a provocation. It makes me angry. Why can't they make it a more gentle noise? It's like it could be like, sir, it's the wrong weight, or I don't know, something more pleasant.
Anyway, absolutely.
whatever. So are you primarily helping companies that have environments, like retail spaces that consumers come into, or does a lot of this also carry over into like media production and the little transitional sounds? And I remember Gary Vee came out a few years ago with his audio, I think he called it his audio stamp, where at the beginning of every Gary Vee video, there was like a little graphic that had a particular sound that he had designed for it. Do you work on the media and production side too, or just environmental spaces?
Yeah, at the core, you want to have your guidelines covering every aspect of sound that's important for your brand. And typically the DNA of the thing is what you were just describing, commonly known as a sonic logo. So it's very, very much like your visual logo, except it's a short sound. So you think of McDonald's, or you think of Intel, da, 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 da. That kind of thing is very powerful. So yes, we make those, but the speciality of the sound agency really, as you say, is sound in physical spaces, shopping malls, stores, showrooms, offices. All sorts of spaces which are important and branded, where sound has a huge effect on what people do and how they feel. And generally, what you get is mindless pop music being purveyed, which incidentally, actually, if it's fast-paced, speeds people up and they leave a space sooner than they otherwise would. So there's a lot of inappropriate, just noise or badly designed sound out there. And we're doing our best to get that put right. So
if somebody's listening to this, they might be thinking, well, that's all great if I own a chain of supermarkets, or, I lease a chain of stores or whatnot. But most people, I think the way I certainly came across you was actually dealing with the sound that everybody's responsible for to some degree, which is the sound of their own voice.
Yeah.
And I'm one of, I don't know, tens, if not hundreds of millions of people that were introduced to you through your TED Talk about how to speak so that people listen. Which I actually can share. I've listened to multiple times, and I was like, not only did I listen to that, I think I took notes on it and I pulled it up, and it was literally 2 months ago to the day was the most recent time I listened to it. And I have a whole page of notes that I took from it. The 7 deadly sins of talking. I'm looking at it right now. The 4 cornerstones of powerful and positive speech, 4 elements of using your voice like an instrument. And it was, I'm a former musician myself too, and a singer. So I was really, really just obviously taken by it. That's why I re-listened to it and took a bunch of notes. But how did you start parlaying what you were doing, in terms of sound engineering for companies, and actually get into the actual use of the human voice? When did that change happen?
I had a little epiphany, really, when I realized that brands are groups of people, really. Companies are groups of people. And the reason they are not very good at listening or at making designed sound or intentional sound is because the people in the organizations are not doing that. The people are not listening. And listening is, a tragically underestimated skill. Most people think it's a capability. It's not. We don't teach it in schools at all. I'm not aware of any schools that do. There may be 1 or 2, but it's really rare. And yet it's a crucial life skill. If you want to be a great salesperson, any top salesperson will tell you the most important part of the sales conversation is not the speaking, it's the listening, where you understand what the needs of the other person are. You're really getting them, and you're able then to sell in an effective way, as opposed to, being bombastic or irrelevant. So listening is crucial. At home, what's the biggest complaint in relationships? He or she never listens to me. It's crucial in business relationships, where it's actually one of the skills that people recruit on now. But strangely, when they've recruited their good listeners, there's no appraisal on it. The 360 degree doesn't say, is this person a good listener? It's just forgotten about. People don't train on it. They don't appraise on it. They don't reward for it. So it's taken for granted. The moment we get into an organization, listening is just like, oh yeah, we all do that. Well, we don't. Many people don't understand it's a skill that you can master, develop, become really good at. And there are so many benefits to doing that. So that was the realization. And that's when I started. The 3rd TED Talk actually was about the ways to improve conscious listening skills. And then the fourth one was a plea to architects to start listening to the spaces they're designing instead of designing everything just for how it looks. Because we have schools and hospitals and offices which are just not fit for purpose. They look great. They sound terrible. And it's impossible to get well, to learn, to work in those spaces. And then, as you say, the fifth TED Talk, that was the one about speaking, which, looking back on it, I was quite brave doing that. I mean, if you're going to stand on a TED stage and talk about talking, you better talk quite well.
Right.
So that's sort of sticking your head above the parapet big time. But it worked really well. I mean, I think I did a good job on that. And they didn't release it for a year.
Isn't it the number 6 TED Talk of all time now, I think?
Amazing. Yeah, it is. I think it's had like 100 million views if you add them all up. Chris Anderson says you have to double whatever is on TED.com because there's YouTube and then there are embedded. It's embedded in lots and lots of websites and and blogs and so forth. So yeah, it's been amazing. It went ballistic. But it's actually quite interesting, Jeff. If you look at the numbers, the TED Talk on speaking that I did has been seen by 5 times as many people as the TED Talk on listening. And that's interesting to me.
Yeah, that seems telling.
Yeah, because listening to me is the core skill, it's the foundational skill. I really think it's difficult to be a great speaker if you're not a good listener. And so many people aren't these days. I think if you look around in the world, in politics, in international relations, never have we needed listening more than we do now in the world.
Well, it's ironic. One of my favorite quotes that I go back to in my head, literally probably once a day, I have reason to reference this thought in my mind, is by John Gottman, who's a relationship expert, who says that the number one way to have influence over another person is for them to feel that they have influence over you. That it engages the natural, instinct for reciprocity, right? And of course, I use this in my marriage all the time, right? And not as like a mercenary tactic, but just as a hopefully an atmosphere of like, babe, I'm always open and I'm receptive and I'm willing, and hopefully she reciprocates, which she does, right? But it occurs to me in this context that probably one of the most important things you could do to get people to listen to you is for them to feel like you are listening to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there's a skill of listening, but then there's probably also the skill of having people feel like you're listening, which maybe aren't exactly the same thing.
They're very similar, I think.
Okay.
And people often say, "Oh, I can't get heard. I feel frustrated. I can't make a difference I want to make in the world because people aren't listening to me. How do I get them to listen to me?" And the answer is, you listen to them. Listen to them. Ask questions. And you can move a conversation, if you don't feel comfortable in the conversation, you can ask questions that move it in a direction towards something you do feel, that's really interesting. Have you ever thought about this aspect of it, which is something I do know about? Now let's talk about that. So if you're actually listening to somebody and engaging with them, which means looking at them, which is something we are not very good at. Tap, tap, tap. I am listening to you. No, you're sending a text. It's not the same thing. So, Scott Peck said you cannot truly listen to another human being and do anything else at the same time, which is quite a big challenge. This life that we live is so distracted. I love that book by Nir Eyal, Indistractable, where he's dealing with all this stuff, because there are so many huge organizations who are hell-bent on getting your attention, my attention, everybody's attention. That's the currency they're after. They want us on that screen looking at that and going, oh, somebody might have tagged me, or, maybe I better reply to something, or, all this stuff going on, which is grabbing our attention away from the people we're with. And there's a great talk by Sherry Turkle on this called Alone Together, a TED Talk and a book she wrote, which is saying really this, that technology, far from bringing us together as a great global village, is actually driving us apart, because we're locking ourselves into these conversations with people we barely know who aren't here at the moment, and ignoring the people next to us, which is, I wonder how many people sit in bed late at night doing email next to their partner. I mean, we've all done it. Mm-hmm. And so that device, which is kind of glued to our hand, that can be very, very pernicious. And it's a real threat to our ability to listen. And of course, the other thing technology is doing is it's pandering to one of the great human needs, which I think is terribly destructive in our communication. And that's the desire to be right. And we have so much of that going on now. And it's deepened by the internet because we have these silos of people who have increasingly extreme entrenched views. And because there's a few hundred of them in that place, they all reinforce it. Hey, well, I knew I was right. Hundreds agree with me. Yeah, but there are millions who don't, but you don't go and talk to them, you know? So we get these kind of silos of increasingly frenzied and potentially quite difficult and even violent views, which is very unfortunate. You know, Harville Hendrix, who's a man I have a lot of respect for, a relationship counselor and author from America, said, you can either be right or be in a relationship.
Yeah, so my therapist actually references Harville Hendrix often, Hendrix and Gottman, and there's a number of them. But he frames it as, he'll ask couples directly. He's like, look, what do you want more? Do you want to be right or do you want to be close? And it's a binary choice. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about how it all kind of connects together, because the more right you believe you are, the less you listen, and the less other people feel listened to, which means the more they will naturally go seek places where they do feel listened to, which are going to be these insular silos where they feel right. And the reason they feel listened to isn't necessarily even because they're being listened to, but just because they're being agreed with. And so like we're fragmented. So I'm sort of connecting the dots here and agreeing with you that, yeah, at the core of a lot of the fragmentation and polarization of society, probably one could argue it's the breakdown of our listening to each other. And that's why we're not close as a society.
Because, the upshot of conscious listening to me is always understanding. So I may disagree with you thoroughly, Jeff, but I can say, Jeff, I totally disagree, but I can see why you believe that. Now that is validation, which again is an important part of Harville Hendrix's work, where you don't have to agree with somebody. You can listen to them, validate that they believe that, and that's, in their world, that's a sensible thing for them to believe, and agree to disagree. I think Barack Obama said, I will listen to you, especially if we disagree, which is quite a brave statement. And not many people would go along with that because we don't like to be challenged. We don't like our cage to be shaken and to be stirred into maybe reassessing something that we really believe in. I always say we listen through a set of filters. And I put these into the TED Talk, the third one. So things like the language we speak, which has filters in it, the culture we're born into, the values, attitudes, and beliefs that we gather along the way from our parents, friends, role models, whoever it might be. And then in any given situation, we might have intentions, expectations, emotions going on. All of these things affect how well we can listen to somebody else. So timing is very important because that set of filters is unique to each individual. My listening is different to yours, Jeff. And that's a really important thing for anybody who wants to communicate, to understand, because it's the most common mistake I see being made is assuming everybody listens like I do. They don't. They absolutely don't. And once you get that you're speaking into a listening which is unique to that person at that moment, then you can start to tailor the way you speak and ask yourself the question, what's the listening I'm speaking into? And that's a big part of my work, is that sensitivity.
So it kind of reminds me of like the love languages concept, where you're trying to understand how they're going to be best able to receive what it is that you want to give. So do you have a taxonomy or a framework for styles of listening, or easy to reference names that we can apply to these styles and try to remember them in the moment?
I don't think it's as complicated as that. What I train people to do is simply to ask that question over and over and over again in every conversation and get into the habit of asking that question. And it is, in my experience anyway, simply true that if you ask the question over and over again, what's the listening? What's the listening I'm speaking to here? You become more and more sensitive to it. Don't ask me how. I mean, it may be, tiny micro expressions or body language or pheromones. I don't know, whatever it is, or a combination of all sorts of cues, subtle cues. Obviously, there are going to be things which are much clearer. Like if I'm standing on stage talking to an audience of young people, I have to change the way I speak and my cultural references. If I'm talking to a group of people who are listening to me and they speak a foreign language and they're having to translate, which I've done many, many times, I have to speak more slowly and more clearly because they're doing a really tough job of translating simultaneously in their heads at the same time as listening to me. So it's a question of being sensitive to the group of people or the person you're speaking to. If you're speaking to somebody who speaks really, really slowly, then if you're speaking like this, you're absolutely at the wrong wavelength. You're going to intimidate them. So we do, there's a degree to which this is natural. Human beings match and mirror other human beings. They tend to make similar gestures. They tend to adopt similar postures and so forth. So a lot of this is automatic. It's just being a person. But you can get really good at it if you ask that question, what's the listening, all the time, instead of just blithely assuming that everybody listens like I do and the way I normally speak is going to work in all situations. Not true.
So do you coach people to, how would I say that, to sort of, I guess, work on their voice? Because I could see how and I'm curious if you get this, people are like, well, it's too distracting, or if I'm thinking about the way I sound, it creates a self-consciousness that makes me unnatural. And I mean, I'm assuming you get that feedback. So how do you sort of work with people to intentionally change the way they sound to other people? Seems like that'd be a hard thing to do.
It's exactly like working with, a top sportsman or woman. If you're working with somebody who's a great golfer, for example, you practice like mad and you're working on a particular part of the technique. The last thing they want to do when they go out into a tournament is think about that. When you're in a tournament or in a real life situation, you're doing what you do naturally as well as possible. And all that practice that you've done beforehand has given you greater ability, that has given you more tools, more capabilities, more confidence, whatever it may be. So, yes, I would absolutely suggest people work on their vocal toolbox, all of the elements of the voice that I talk about. And I mean, I'm quite throaty at the moment. I've just recovered from a chest infection. But you can overcome things like that by breathing, by posture and so forth, and also by projecting your voice, by resonating the right areas, and by thinking about pace and pitch and silence and volume and all of these aspects of the voice that we don't tend to think about at all. Now, I'm not saying think about them while you're in an important conversation. No, practice them in peaceful places, which you can do by, getting a book and reading out loud and recording yourself and listening and practicing extending your range with things like volume. I've had people in seminars in the past when I used to do seminars coming up and going, I am shouting. This is as loud as I can speak. No, you just haven't explored it yet.
Right.
The human voice is an amazing instrument. It's the instrument we all play. I mean, you're a singer, so you play it really. But I mean, I'm not a singer. Nevertheless, I do think when you listen to the range of voices, the power of the human voice, what it can achieve in the world, it behooves us all to master it. And I am flabbergasted when I stand on stage. I'll talk to 2,000 CEOs about communication skills. And I'll say to them, how many of you have to use your voice in public like you do presentations or you stand on stages? A forest of hands go up. Okay. How many of you have had formal vocal training? 3 or 4. What's that about? It's crazy.
Yeah.
You know, the human voice is so important to these people. They're representing organizations, they're on the media, they're on stages, and yet they've never thought about training this incredible instrument in them and unleashing its power. Nuts.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting you're saying that. We, in the last year, there was somebody in my organization who the feedback was, there were 2 points of feedback, but I'd say in general, it was sort of like, yeah, basically they don't listen that much. They talk a lot more than they listen, and their presentation style is sort of rambling and a little bit monotonous, but also sort of there's not a lot of space, right? No pausing, and you know, that's feedback, and that's good for them. But one of the it was a very related challenge that we were dealing with, but we didn't connect the dots initially. Was we were having a lot of trouble with recruitment and really, you know, getting A players on that team. And eventually it clicked. Somebody pointed out, well, that's because they're interviewing with a person that talks a lot more than they listen. And they're not, and so they're not having a good interview experience, which is completely scuttling all the other good things that might otherwise attract them to come work on that team.
Yeah.
And so we found that feedback not only improved professional performance internally, but it also, I mean, that was a price we didn't even realize we were paying because of how one person communicated not terribly effectively.
It's so important at every level, whether you're running a team and trying to inspire them and motivate them, or whether you're trying to persuade your boss to go in the direction you believe is the right direction, whatever it is, or recruit people. I mean, my goodness, that's so important. If you do an interview with somebody and you sound bored, what are they going to pick up? This is a boring place to work. You know, I used to, in my company, I used to love in the middle of an interview saying to people, like, just go out of my office and talk to anybody and ask them what it's like to work here. Because I knew what the answer was going to be from all those people. It was going to be, it's fantastic. We love it. It's great. You know, and that's all you need, really, if that's the truth. And it was in that organization. So I think, yes, you need to inspire people all the time. And that's a function of speaking, as you say, not necessarily speaking a lot, but knowing when to speak, when to listen, what to say, because of course it's not just how you say it, it's what you say as well, and really being sensitive to the listening you're speaking into, caring about it. You know, I mean, I think it's important to have humility and to see every person you meet as an opportunity to learn. Now, it may be that you're learning how not to do something, often is, but in many cases, you'll be learning how to do things if you are open to that. And it's unfortunate that we go through life quite arrogant a lot of the time, dismissing people, judging people, and not getting the juice out of every conversation we have. We're only here for a limited time. And I think it's so important to extract everything you can from every conversation, really.
How important do you think it is, people, you know, in other words, sorry, let me start the question over. How much of having a compelling vocal delivery is mechanistic, meaning the manipulation of the instrument, and how much of it do you think is like emotional or psychological, meaning the voice is displaying or perhaps even betraying what's really going on with a person? In other words, can you master the voice purely as a mechanism, or do you have to do some of the deeper work on oneself to get the voice, you know, in a way that really lines up for people?
I think it's important to be authentic. I mean, I said those 4 cornerstones of powerful speaking, and
hail. They
spell the word hail, yes. Right, so honesty, yes, being clear and straight. Authenticity is really important, being who you really are. People can generally spot if you're faking it, if you're putting something on. And even if they can't, it's, you know, it's stressful, it's tiring to pretend that you're a high energy, aggressive person when you're actually a very introverted, quiet person. We don't need to do that. Susan Cain, I think, has broken the back of that myth that only loud people are effective, and, really underscored the value of introverts in business and how we need to listen more carefully to people and give even quiet people the chance to contribute the wonderful things they can. So pretending, no. Generating yourself, absolutely switching yourself on 100%, that's really powerful. Not being disengaged or cautious or shy or frightened. And there are ways to overcome all of those things which are holding you back. And so knowing how to do it with a voice, I think, is very powerful. To me, all it comes down to is consciousness, because this is all listening, speaking, communication. To me, it's all a conversation about consciousness, awareness, presence, actually being here at this moment, being with the other person at this moment, fully present. And if you're doing that, and you've practiced the mechanics of the voice so that you are in control of it and you have mastered it, then you give yourself a great chance of putting yourself across in the right way to the other person, fully as you, authentic and really there, but powerful.
What do you, I guess, how much or how do you approach situations where people, I think, a lot of people hear this type of conversation and instinctively will go to helping unlock or unleash the voice, right? Get louder or have it project better or have it carry more emotion or having it land better. But what about the inverse of that, where you have people that actually need to be reined in? I mean, like you talked about, there's people that are loud and they steamroll everyone around them. And is there a different... I mean, I guess, how do you approach that? And how often do those people have enough self-awareness to maybe allow you to approach them?
Well, again, it's about consciousness, isn't it? And if you're conscious of the listening you're speaking into, you're conscious that you're speaking to a quiet and slow person, and you need to calm yourself down and deliver in a way that's going to get the ball over the net to them at that moment. That's what it's all about. And there's such a joy to me in connecting with somebody by listening carefully to them and asking yourself, what's the listening that I'm speaking into? It comes naturally, and unfortunately, that person who perhaps speaks all the time and interrupts other people and dismisses what they're saying and doesn't respect them, that's not conscious. That's somebody who's wrapped up in perhaps their ego and, hasn't challenged what's going on inside of them, the need to prove that they're right, the need to be better, the need to be bigger, the need to be, authoritative, respected, whatever it is, whatever need is driving that. So this is a huge conversation, really, Jeff. It's not just about how we speak and listen. It's about how we are as human beings, how we relate to other human beings. And to me, as I say, it always comes down to the one thing, which is being conscious. It's one of the reasons I love speaking on stages, for example, because that's the time when I'm probably the most conscious. If there's 2,000 people staring at you, every gesture, every facial expression, every word that you say, and every tone of your voice need to be conscious. If you're doing something that's irritating, a tick, like walking round and round on the spot or leaning from one side to the other and leaning to the other side and so forth, these things are so obvious to the people watching. So those unconscious things, those are things that we can train out, and the biggest tip I ever give to anybody who speaks in public is, for goodness sake, video yourself. It's so easy to do now. Just get a tripod that you can stick your phone on, turn the video on and deliver your talk, and then watch it back and you'll be going, oh my goodness, I never knew I did that.
One thing we haven't, you sort of touched on, but it's the L in hail is love. Mm. And I have in my notes, wishing well for people. And I wrote this down. I assume you said it. This tempers honesty and neutralizes judgment.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I mean, I really believe that you can't love and judge simultaneously. I think it's very difficult to hold those two things.
You said that in the TED Talk, right?
Yeah. And that's my experience in life. If you're judging somebody, you're suspending your love for them at that moment. And again, that often comes down to the need to be right, or the need to be justified in some way, or they need to look good, perhaps. I don't know. It can be any of those things. Loving, in that sense, not romantic love, but what Christians would call agape, or Buddhists would call loving kindness. I mean, there's lots and lots of expressions of this in religions all over the world. It comes down to wishing somebody well. And I had a friend many, many years ago who gave me a wonderful exercise on this that I'll pass on now. And that is to formulate in your mind and just say over and over again the words, bless you. It doesn't have to be religious. It can be if you're religious, but it can just be a well-wishing thing. And instead of walking around a city and thinking dark and horrible thoughts about the people who bump into you or step into your way, or cause you some sort of obstruction in what you want, then you can be thinking, bless you. And if you do that over and over again, it is extraordinary what happens. You start feeling that you're walking several inches above the ground. Everything becomes light. You meet somebody's gaze, and what happens? You smile at each other because you weren't thinking a horrible thing about them. So you're not shiftily trying to avoid people seeing what's going on inside your head. It's a very lovely exercise. It's very cleansing. It's very simple to do. And it really gives you a lightness of being, which is enormously enjoyable. So I recommend that to anybody, as opposed to, the constant editor critic that we have in our head judging other people. So loving, I think, is very important. And of course, as I said in the TED Talk, it is needed to temper honesty. We don't need to say, oh, you look terrible today to somebody. It's not really necessary. It might be helpful, but if you're loving, then perhaps you just withhold that kind of thing. We don't have to be brutally honest the whole time. That's not a part of being clear and straight in the sense of honesty that I'm using it. And the only other one we didn't cover, actually, Jeff, was the I, wasn't it? Integrity, which is being your word. If you say it, you do it. You're somebody people can rely on to carry on through and deliver what you promise. And that's very important. If you don't do that, your words evaporate. They are not taken seriously.
Yeah, somebody told me integrity is doing what you say you're going to do. It's also how you act when people aren't looking, and whether or not you're the same when people are watching or aren't. That's a piece of integrity. But also this element of, like, if you can't keep a commitment to someone, you proactively address it and you renegotiate the commitment beforehand. You never let it pass.
Yeah. Or if you make a mistake, you apologize and you put something in place to make sure that doesn't recur, as opposed to, one of the 7 deadly sins I talked about, which is blame throwing, excuses. It wasn't my fault. If it's never your fault, you don't learn anything at all, really.
So one should actually seek for it to be their fault, because then they open themselves up to the lesson.
Some lessons are painful to learn.
At least embrace it if it is. Maybe you don't seek it, but you're open to it. Yeah. So final question, and I know we're about out of time. I'm curious if you could, I guess however loving or brutally honest you wish to be, but if you could sort of appraise me based on your analysis, your observation here of what is the listening that you've been speaking into. I think it'd be really valuable to hear the language you use to describe another person's listening.
Well, I think your listening has been incredibly attentive, Jeff, to be honest. You're clearly on the same page as me, so I feel very comfortable that we're in a conversation where we're learning things and we are reflecting different facets of the diamond as we go around it. But I didn't feel at any stage there was any kind of reluctance or any kind of resistance. I'm very sensitive to those things in audiences. If you're in a conversation with an audience, you can see the pockets of resistance or reluctance or whatever it may be. And it's very important to address those if it's possible to do so. Where I would always do that. So I have felt a very, what Italians would call simpatico listening from you, an attentive listening, and also an articulate listening. I mean, you've been able all the way through to articulate and to ask some very intelligent questions. So, I mean, I've enjoyed this conversation enormously. It has not been a difficult conversation. If, you had been a highly aggressive, difficult interviewer, then there are ways of getting around that, going onto that person's island and understanding what is their problem with what you're saying. What is it they're trying to establish? I haven't needed to do that because I think we're on the same island in the first place, to be honest. So
we're together on Orkney Island, right?
Yeah, that would be nice. Anytime you come up here, let me know.
I would love that. So I actually have 3 different open invitations to visit Scotland from 3 different people. So the universe is giving me a strong signal. I'm curious. I know I said the last question was last question. This is actually my last question. Any thoughts or tips around how to apply your teachings in a Zoomified world where so much talking and listening now is happening, like we're doing right now? And what, I've been sort of proactively applying what we're talking about. Like you talked about giving a talk about talking. I feel like I'm trying to listen about listening, having that same sort of meta experience. But how do you, when it comes to applying it in a Zoom environment, do you have any tips or thoughts for people?
Yes, I mean, there are a lot, and I do webinars and so forth on virtual communication because this is not going away, right? This is always going to be here now. We've realized how much time, money, and carbon we save by not having to go and see people face to face. Obviously, we will still do that where it's crucial, but this is going to be here forever. And it's necessary to become a master of this now as well. Now, I would say the biggest mistake I see many, many people making is they'll put a laptop on a desk in front of them, tilt the screen back, and sit with a window behind them, producing the classic terrible shot that you get in Zoom calls or whatever, other networks are available. Whatever it is with backlit, so they're a silhouette, and the shot is basically up their nose, which is not very nice to have somebody looming over the top of you like that. So camera at eye level, or in your case, slightly above eye level, is cool. Then, if you want to be, slightly less dominant as you are being, then the camera above eye level, shooting slightly down on you, gives you a nice, non-threatening look. I've got the camera absolutely at my eye level, just above my Mac. Have a nice light, have a green screen if you want behind you, so that you can put what you want across and look professional, and a decent microphone. When I've got a nice little Rode microphone just above me here, headphones so I don't have the sound coming out of the loudspeakers and creating feedback loops, a decently acoustic room I'm in, so that you don't want to do this kind of thing in a bathroom or a kitchen where it's very echoey. Noise control behind you, as you were just doing with a leaf blower. So all these things matter in delivering a signal that looks professional and clean and sounds really, really good. So many people don't do those things. It is absolutely amazing to me. In the most important conversations, pitches for millions of dollars of investment or sales pitches for millions of dollars worth of business, and they've got that backlit, shooting up the nose thing going on. Not good. Also, I think you have to be even more attentive in this medium because you're missing so many cues, little physical cues, little auditory cues. A lot has gone here, and we have to be paying even more attention than we would in a face-to-face conversation.
Yeah, I've noticed you've maintained what I would call, and maybe I'm just more cognizant of it because of the subject matter here, but I've noticed you've maintained extraordinarily what feels almost like disciplined eye contact. You have not, I don't think you've looked away one time. I've been cognizant of it, like I said, because of what we're talking about. And I've noticed a few times I've checked the time in respect to your time and a few other things, but like you are on it with the eye contact. I'll give you credit there. You mentioned that you do webinars about this and other things. Obviously you have services for corporations. I know that I think you have courses. Tell the world what you offer and how to come find you.
Well, if it's about brand or organizational sound, then the website is thesoundagency.com. If it's about individual communication skills, then that's my website, which is juliantreasure.com. And yes, I go around the world delivering keynotes and workshops and things like that for big organizations who are interested in improving the communication skills in their often senior management, if not just everybody. And for those who don't want to go to an event or aren't involved in that, then I have a course which you can access through my website. I have a book called How to Be Heard, which is available from all the usual places. And actually, I'm very excited to be working on a new book at the moment, Jeff, which is manuscript is due in March. It's major, but I am cracking through it. It's a book all about the wonders of sound. And it's kind of my life's work, really. So that will be out in spring 24. And that's coming from Quercus Books. And it's really exciting. It's called Everything is Sound. And I'm so excited to be doing that. So, yeah, communication skills, juliantreasure.com, and branding and corporate sound, thesoundagency.com.
If you loved that episode, then you're definitely going to love this one. Check it out.
We, as storytellers, as marketers, as whatever it is, our job is to serve the audience. It's to tell the best story possible, to teach the lesson possible. I'm always asking myself, does this serve the guest and the audience in the story?